Good day to you, students, and welcome to our first lecture on the subject of business correspondence and reporting under your CA Foundation exam. Now, the topic for today, for our first lesson together, is report writing. How you write a report, what goes into it, where is it used, and so on. So, as a chartered accountant, आपको आपकी लाइफ में कई सारे रिपोर्ट्स लिखने पड़ेंगे. बहुत बोरिंग काम है लेकिन करना तो पड़ेगा इसीलिए कैसे किया जाता है ये जानना भी आपके लिए जरूरी है. तो चलिए पहले देखते हैं रिपोर्ट होता क्या है. यू टॉक अबाउट व्हाट अ रिपोर्ट इज. सो अ रिपोर्ट इज एनी सॉर्ट ऑफ ऑफिशियल डॉक्यूमेंटेशन or an account or a description of either a specific issue or a general subject or an event. These are usually very objective and evidence based or research based with no scope for any sort of subjective aspects like the author's opinions or feelings or so on. And these reports are written by highly qualified individuals or groups of highly qualified individuals जिसे अक्सर कमिटी या बॉडी कहा जाता है. So reports at large can be divided into two subcategories. पहले आती है the kind of reports that you read in a newspaper or in a journal or in a magazine. So these usually contain informal language. They contain personal references from the author, and they're very subjective in nature, as in the author is free to interpret things the way they want. Whereas organizational reports, which is what we will be focusing on during today's lesson, you're supposed to use formal language. They're supposed to be objective. They're supposed to be data driven. They're supposed to be research driven. And there is no scope for subjectivity like your own feelings, your own opinions on the subject. Those do not matter. So, reports, while they have a specific format, this format varies depending on who you're writing the report for. अगर आप किसी बड़ी कंपनी के लिए रिपोर्ट लिख रहे हैं उनके अपने फॉर्मेट्स होते हैं प्रेजेंटेशंस बनाने के रिपोर्ट्स लिखने के बिकॉज दे फाइंड इट इजियर टू process the data when it's written down in that format, in that order. But of course, there are certain things which are common across every format, a list of which you can see on your screen. So, do you want to dive into more detail on these? Let's check it out. सबसे पहले किसी भी रिपोर्ट में सबसे ज्यादा जरूरी है आपका टाइटल पेज. अगर आप एक रिपोर्ट का प्रिंट आउट निकाल के किसी को दे रहे हो द टाइटल पेज इज द फर्स्ट थिंग दैट द पर्सन सीज. तो इसमें ऑब्वियसली आता है आपके रिपोर्ट का टाइटल, आपके रिपोर्ट का टॉपिक, आपकी रिपोर्ट का हेडिंग, और अगर जरूरी लगे तो आता है आपके रिपोर्ट का एक सब हेडिंग या एक सब टाइटल. उसके बाद आते हैं ऑथर्स के नाम, या फिर एक टू एंड फ्रॉम का सेक्शन होता है इफ इट्स company report for an internal audience, which I will explain what is in due course. You have the to and from section. To is the authority that you report to that will be reading this report, and from is obviously your name and designation. और फिर आती है एक डेट कि इस रिपोर्ट को फाइनली कंपाइल करके प्रेजेंट कब किया गया था. ये हो गया. अब आती है आपकी एग्जीक्यूटिव समरी. एग्जीक्यूटिव समरी जनरली एक या डेढ़ पेज की होती है एंड इट इज अ शॉर्ट समराइजेशन, अ शॉर्ट डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ व्हाट दिस रिपोर्ट इज गोइंग टू अचीव. उसके बाद आता है आपका इंट्रोडक्शन विच इज सपोज टू बी एन ओवरव्यू ऑफ द सब्जेक्ट. अब आप सोचेंगे कि व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन एन एग्जीक्यूटिव समरी एंड एन इंट्रोडक्शन. लेट मी टेल यू. An executive summary only outlines what the report is about and what it will do over the next several pages. Whereas the job of the introduction section is to contextualize all the research that goes into the report. The introduction section where you will have a bit of history regarding the subject. You will have more information to sort of contextualize it. You'll talk about why you need to do this research. What do you expect to get out of this report? Things like that you will add in the introduction. After the introduction, you have your body, which is the main content of the report. Now, obviously, this is going to be divided into chapters, but this is where all your important data goes. When it comes to your literature review, when it comes to your number crunching, when it comes to your statistics, when it comes to any hard data or research or your investigations, if it's an investigative report, that goes into the body. फिर आते हैं आपके फाइंडिंग्स. तो आपकी रिसर्च या आपकी इन्वेस्टिगेशन के बेसिस पर आपने क्या सीखा है, that goes into the findings section, which eventually will develop into the recommendations section. Now, the recommendations section is supposed to be a sort of a list of next steps to be taken on the basis of whatever you have researched and discovered so far. It is a set of actionable intelligence that you're providing to the authority who is going to be leading your report. And at the end, you have the conclusion, which essentially brings together everything and adds a sort of a closing note in your report. And then you have certain additional sections that you need to cater to, them being your references and bibliography and your glossary of terms. Now, you might have wondered कि references और bibliography में क्या फर्क है? So, your list of references is going to consist of anything, any data sources that you have directly used in your report. Those will go into your list of references. And any general literature that you have read to inform yourself around the topic, but have not used directly in this report, goes into the bibliography. And a glossary of terms is important because कई industries में उनके अपने टेक्निकल टर्म्स होते हैं, अपना टेक्निकल जार्गन होता है, एब्रीविएशंस होते हैं, एक्रोनिम्स होते हैं, जो बाहर के लोगों को समझ में नहीं आते. इसीलिए अगर आप इसका यूजेज अवॉइड नहीं कर सकते, इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट टू इंक्लूड अ ग्लॉसरी ऑफ टर्म्स सो दैट ले पर्सन्स और पीपल आउटसाइड द इंडस्ट्री रीडिंग योर रिपोर्ट will understand what it is about. So, there is a defined process for writing a report, the flowchart for which you can see on your screen now. So, the most important thing to do before you start writing a report is to understand the purpose of the report. Why are you writing this? What are you going to get out of this? What will be the end result? Once you know that, you have a fair idea of what sort of information, what sort of research you need to include in this. So, you start with gathering the information, which is our step 2. Once you've gathered all the information you need, you have to organize it. Ideally, you should organize it in a chronological form. Chronological means according to the time that those events occurred. And once you have done that, you have to analyze the material that you have. You have to analyze all the literature you have, all the data, all the statistics, all the numbers, and so on and so forth to weed out any irrelevant information that you may not need. So once all of that is done is when you start drafting the first report, linking all of this together. Obviously, once you're done with your first report, you will have a number of errors. You will have spelling errors. You will have syntax errors. And this is what you need to be careful of when you do your reviewing for errors or when you do your proofreading. Now, proofreading ideally has to be done by 2 different people if you can afford that privilege. Now, when you're through with your proofreading, you might realize that, okay, this report is ready to be presented, and you might present your final report. Or you might decide to write an entirely new draft, go through the cycle again until you reach the point where you present the final report that you are satisfied. So that's what the steps are going to look like. Now, general points to remember when you're writing an organizational report is that these reports, as I said, must be entirely objective. They have to be data driven, they have to be evidence driven. There is simply no space for your personal objectives or your personal feelings about the matter. The report has to be structured with respect to its target audience. Now, if you write an organizational report that only the people from within the organization or only the higher ups in the organization are going to read, it's going to have a different structure. Whereas if you write a report which will eventually be released to the public, you need to add more information to contextualize everything. In terms of language, you have to remember always use past tense because you're very likely writing about something that has already happened. Always use passive voice. And most importantly, always use or always speak in the third person. You cannot use pronouns like I, me, myself, he, she, or you, me, or so on and so forth. You have to speak in the third person, they or them. Those are the kind of pronouns you want to use. Your language should be clear and concise. You have to avoid long, winding, repetitive sentences. Try to keep your sentences short and to the point. And you have to rely on a chronological structure because the reader may not have time to go back and forth, try to piece together the entire narrative. So you write about events in the order that they occurred, in the order that they happened. So event A, event B, event C, like that. Try to avoid using technical jargon unless it is necessary. And if you must use one, remember to include a glossary of terms at the end of your report. Like I said, laypersons reading this need to know what those things mean. And again, there is no space for grammatical errors. So please proofread everything before you submit it. So here we have a sample formal report which I've gathered from your study material on the ICAI website. So we'll go into depth on each of the sections of this report. We'll talk about it, help contextualize the information that I've just loaded you up with. So in this, you can see there's the title, Ganga River Cleaning Project. You have a to section and a from section. These are two officers from the Ministry of Environment. One is the author and one is the receiver, which makes me believe that this is a internal report. This is not going to be released to the public. You have the date, very precise date. You have the subject. You have the acknowledgements section. So any persons or any institutions that have helped you compile your report, either by providing you with data or with statistics or any sort of help in the course of preparing this report, they have to go in the acknowledgements section. Then you have your table of contents. The introduction, causes, effects, solutions, conclusion, bibliography. We'll go through each of these sections together now. So here you can see at first you have the summary, your executive summary. Like I said, this is what I'm going to read, and this is what is going to help me decide whether the contents of this report are useful to me or should I just move along. Then you have the introduction section. So the introduction section adds a bit more context to the scope of the research. So it talks about the river Ganga, it's called a dying river, and several solutions to clean it have been suggested, and so on and so forth. And then it talks about the causes of the pollution. You have overexploitation, you have dumping of sewage waste, you have a number of causes for this. And then you have a list of effects. So now from the causes, you understand that the Ganga river is polluted. How does it affect the ecosystem around it? Spread of disease harms the food chain, flooding harms animals, so on and so forth. So this is what would come under your body. So all your hard data goes in these sections. Then you have a list of solutions that has been suggested based on what we know from the introduction in the body. The author has suggested a list of steps that can be taken to help prevent the pollution of the water in the river from getting worse. So, this is what I talked about when I said actionable intelligence. You give them a list of specific steps that they can take to mitigate the problem. और उसके बाद आता है आपका conclusion, which sort of brings the whole thing together into a close as a sort of a closing note. इसमें आपके bibliography और references को merge किया हुआ है. In this case, it is understandable because the list itself is too small. But this is what your list would look like in the sample that has been provided to you. So this is an open source report that I found over the internet because as I said, the sample report given to you under your syllabus was fairly small. But this is an actual report that has been prepared with regards to a project and it'll help us go more in depth into the aforementioned sections. So let's look at it. So obviously here you have the title page for your report. It contains the title in bold. It says mapping the circular maker environment. Then you have a subtitle. Now the reason a subtitle is important here is if you read it, it says B2.1. And the numbering system makes me believe that the project itself is much larger. But this report only deals with one specific section of this project. So to contextualize that, the presence of a subtitle is necessary. Then you have the names of the authors, Julie Meta and Chris Bacchus. And you have a date. Now, if you understand that this report is meant for an external audience, it was released to the public, which is why I have access to it in some sense. You can get away with having generic or non-specific dates like these, which is why you don't need to add 17th June of 2020 or so on and so forth. That's the key difference. Again, acknowledgements. So the longer your report, the bigger your acknowledgements section should be. Now, this report runs well over 30 pages. So the acknowledgement section is proportionally larger. This is what your table of contents is going to look like. So if you notice it, first you have the executive summary. If you see the cursor on the screen, then you have the list of abbreviations and acronyms, which is a glossary of terms, as I said. And you have a list of figures and tables. Figures are the graphics that you use, either in forms of a diagram or a map or something like that. And tables are tables. You know what tables are. Come on. Then, once those three are out of the way, your chapters begin. So, first you have the introduction. Now, if you look at the introduction, it is subdivided into 4 sections. You have the Pop Machina project, which talks about the project at large. You have Work Package 2, which is this report. Then you have Objectives of Deliverable 2.1. So, a deliverable is what will come out of this report, what will be delivered as a result of this research report. And what that deliverable aims to achieve by itself is what we refer to as the objectives of the deliverable. And then you have the methods. So the introduction section contextualizes the entire report. It contextualizes the research. It gives a background as to why we are doing this. Whereas the executive summary, as I said before, is just a summarization of what is going to happen over the next various pages. Remember, the executive summary is important because it's the first thing I'm going to read in the report to decide whether I want to go through the rest of it or not. Then you have the body or the chapters. You have chapter 2, bibliometric review. You have chapter 3, defining the maker movement, and so on. We'll look at this in a bit. Again, your executive summary. This is what it's supposed to look like. 1 page, 1.5 page, general summarization of everything that the report plans to do. Your executive summary cannot contain the text meant for your conclusion. You only talk about what you plan to do in the executive summary. You don't talk about the results of your research. You just talk about what you're planning on achieving. Everything else I mentioned goes into the conclusion. Remember that. Then, like I said, you have the introduction, you have the first few paragraphs that contextualize the rest of the research. You have a nice little Venn diagram here as to where the two parts of the research intersect. Then you have the different chapters. Again, very nice Venn diagram that talks about the initiatives of the maker movement. Then you have a chapter that is essentially creating hard set definitions for all the phrases that you're going to be using in the scope of this research. This is what your chapters would ideally look like. Then you have the list of recommendations or the policy recommendations. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that this has been divided into two categories again. First, you have the recommendations for the city level. So, what can be done to make this project more viable? And you have recommendations at the national or subnational level. Because the higher up you go in the government hierarchy, the more power, the more reach, the more influence these bodies have. So you need to have a separate set of actionable intelligences for different levels of the hierarchy, if applicable. And then you have the conclusion. The conclusion, as I said before, is a sort of a closing note for the entire report where you bring together everything that you have achieved. And in this case, it has also included a list of tools that were developed as part of this research. You have a framework about the concept, you have a set of definitions for the phrases that you've used, you have a survey which will probably be used in an upcoming part of the project, you have several maps, and so on and so forth. We won't go into the details of all of these. But this is what your conclusion should look like: a closing note on all your research that talks about everything you've achieved in it, everything that you haven't mentioned in the executive summary. Then you have your list of references. Now, if you look here, if you look at the first instance in the list, it says Achterberg E, Hinfelar J, and Bocken N. So there are three authors for this research paper. It was written in the year 2006, and then you have the title. This is something referred to as the APA referencing format. And this is the best way to structure your list of references because should any of the readers of your report want more information on something that you've said in the report, they need to be able to look up this entire list and find where that information came from. A correctly referenced report also gives more credibility to whatever your findings are, to whatever your claims are, to whatever your list of recommendations are. It gives you more credibility. It gives you a stronger standing. People know that you have actually conducted your research. हवा में बात नहीं कर रहे हैं हम, ये लोगों को भरोसा हो जाता है पढ़ने वालों को. So that's it from my end. I hope you learned something today and I hope you enjoyed learning it. I hope to see you again soon. So please subscribe to this space for more content regarding your business communication and reporting or BCR. Thank you. My name is Varun. Ciao.